Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody to this session, which is essential questions to ask for a seamless Tableau project. And today we have Ruth, who's from our data school cohort number 15, who's going to be taking you through this presentation. So Ruth, over to you.
Thanks, Lorna. So I'm here to talk about essential questions for your Tableau project. This webinar is based around this dashboard and accompanying blog post, and Lorna's going to share the links with you for those. So these are questions that you need to consider at any stage of your project. And while this is laid out in sort of a row, what we're going to focus on in this session is understanding how each of these different project elements are actually important at every stage of the product, how you set up, how you deliver it, and you need to be thinking about these sort of in conjunction with each other at every time throughout your project. We're going to start off by talking about aspects of the project and the different ways you can sort of separate your thinking about different parts of your project. Your roles and responsibilities and how these might change a lot depending on the size of your organization or your skill level. But again, regardless of what you're doing, you need to be aware of all of these things. We'll talk about some relevant scenarios and sort of some common issues maybe that might arise, and again, why it's important to preempt these by asking these questions early on in the project. And then how to compile all the answers you get into use code toolkits that can then give you the right information to ask from people, to keep for yourself, and to share with others to make sure the project runs smoothly. So the first thing, the aspects of a Tableau project, we can divide it into 4 sections of the data, the visualization, the interpretation, and the insights. And what I mean by those is the data is obviously the structure, the location, who owns it, who updates it, what size it's going to be, and how it's processed. So you're asking a lot of questions like, you know, who's actually responsible for these different parts? Who do I need to contact to get what I need for the data? How is it structured? How is it going to be updated? Things like, if I'm planning certain charts, what does my data need to look like before I even begin building? And how do I compile the data to make sure it's possible? Again, depending on what time periods you're using, are we going to be refreshing it? Do we need certain structure for the design? What sort of permissions do we need in place before we access data and share it with other people to manage our security? And again, sort of content and project flow, how we're managing the time of delivering all of these things. Next, you have your visualization, and that comprises everything you sort of build in the physical dashboard. What kind of charts, what features it has, where it lives, whether it's online or being directly sent to people, and who's able to access it. So again, you're going to be thinking about all the questions relating to the data structure. How can I actually build it? What kind of interactivity it's going to have? What sort of data story I have to actually make me choose the charts I'm building? What sort of content, like what kind of calculations I'm going to be using? What's my data structure, my performance constraints, and all the most basic things like best practice, color scheme, what's the branding. The interpretation we can consider as how people actually interact and understand with your visualization. And again, you're thinking about all of these things of the content you have, the data story, how it's designed, and how you're going to actually onboard people so that they find your dashboard legible, accurate, functional, and something that they can easily use. And then lastly, there's the actual insights. Does your data actually, or does your dashboard actually answer the questions that they want to answer? Does it highlight the correct trends, changes, and outliers? And is it delivering insights that they not only want to use your dashboard, but they actually are using your dashboard and benefiting and driving the business forward after that? So you can see no matter what sort of area you're focusing on, a lot of questions that kind of cross over your project elements are important. Another thing that makes a huge difference in sort of the things you need to know is your role in the organization, and that will depend on the structure and also your skill level. So for example, here in a small organization, you're going to have maybe a very dynamic role where you're managing a lot of your own design and data decisions. You're sort of communicating very frequently and informally with management, and you're sort of just having a lot of flexibility. There's low content diffusion, and that means that basically your Tableau dashboard sort of stays maybe on your computer. Maybe someone comes and looks at it, you email sort of a copy, but it's very much sort of under your control. Then you might have a situation where you have a higher number of users, and your role might become still, it can be quite dynamic because there's only a few people, you're sharing responsibilities. You might have some separation where maybe you collaborate with others to get your data. You're working with each other to align between how your dashboards are designed, but you're still having a lot of flexibility with management where maybe they're also Tableau users. So they're editing your dashboards themselves, they're picking up where you left off. So it's still quite flexible. Then you might find yourself in a situation where you don't have a lot of Tableau users, but you have a much larger organization. And in this situation, you're going to find much more specialized roles. You might have dedicated design teams. You'll have sort of a lot more separation between yourself and management. And then you're going to find yourself maybe trying to ask more questions relating to, am I getting the right messages through the chains of command? Am I being very clear about how the data is coming from? You might have parallel organizations that aren't using Tableau, but they are having sort of design systems in place that you need to align your design decisions with. And then you could have obviously the situation where you've got a lot of users in a large organization. And then you're going to have, again, lots of very specialized roles, but you're going to have much more established sort of best practices between the different Tableau users. They're going to have very clearly defined governance and analytics strategy. And you'll find that the structured and planning between data collection, cleaning and distribution, visual best practice, and sort of timelines are a little bit more rigid. And in fact, in the perfectly run organization, you're going to have, a very clear Tableau blueprint where they're following best practice. They've got clearly defined sort of role owners and processes in place. They've got clearly defined metrics and procedures for discovery, prototyping, getting feedback, sort of structuring their data, and then moving on for the sort of large scale release. So that's sort of the optimal strategy, that's everybody's working towards. But in reality, most roles are sort of somewhere in the middle, where it's kind of the wild west, where everyone's moving towards a best practice, but these things are just so new that it hasn't actually been set in stone. And this is where sort of a lot of the problems arise, is where you've got sort of business practices that are not really applying to the Tableau structure. So the first thing we're going to look at here is a scenario where maybe you are a dashboard builder and you've got a project manager who is coordinating with upper levels of management. Now, this also applies whether you're a dashboard builder or you're a project manager. So you're asking things like, what is your role as a Tableau user? Am I actually a developer, or am I a manager, or am I an analyst? Am I going to be required to answer specific questions, or am I going to be actually required to create creative solutions and really consult on the data structure or on the distribution? You need to be aware about your general level of proficiency. Am I actually capable of doing this job? So the stakeholder might have some preferences or some ideas, and then they're translated through to either you as the project manager or somebody else. And then it comes through to you, and you might say, well, actually, I've only been using the basic functions of Tableau, and I'm not ready to, take on this sort of a project. So you have to be sure that you know your level, you know how to identify people if you need help or development. You can ask, do you have challenges with sort of defining the design? Do you have challenge with sort of communicating feedback, etc.? So it's really important to understand what your role is and communicate that up and down. And the same thing with actually understanding the data story. Is this information getting passed through to you? Because you have alternate situations where maybe you'd say, I'm the only person who knows how to use Tableau, but I'm not being invited to the meetings where the decisions and feedback are being made. And then you have the same questions of, how am I actually finding what is the data story? because I need to know not just what people want to happen, but what are the actual outcomes from this. And I might have some better experience to better interpret what's actually being required from stakeholders. And this obviously would affect as well your design, like who is actually responsible for actioning and feedback. You need to know that as a Tableau user, and who's driving design decisions. So if somebody says, I'm driving the design decisions, I just need you to implement them, then you can say, okay, I don't have to sort of start thinking about things that don't concern me. And vice versa, if you are driving the design decisions, you need to be very clear on the data story and the goals of the dashboards and the specific actions, so you can then creatively interpret them into how you can display or analyze the data. Another scenario is thinking about how your data is actually going to be stored and accessed. So you want to be asking questions like, who's obtaining the data and where is it located? In a smaller organization, you might have just local files that you're taking from a local system, and you may be using Tableau Online where you're putting things in a few little folders and you're sharing them with people. So you're really you're in control of things like the data structure, you're in control of the data connections and the size of the data set. And it's very easy for you to know the answers to these questions. But you can come into then, as organizations grow, you've got very different sort of scenarios where you have maybe a change in how you've got different types of service, different levels of access, different levels of sort of data sources you're working with. So you're asking questions like, again, where is it located and what permissions are required? Do you have access to shared files, or do you only have access to extracts that people are sending you? Is there sort of restrictions in how you share things at the other end? You're being very careful again of like the sizes and the type of data connections are using. Are you actually allowed to use sort of local files, or do you always have to use live data sources? You'll be making sure you understand things like the time periods, because are you going to have to refresh data constantly? Do you need to change how your data is organized so it can be sort of working across different time periods? Depending on how it's treating time, do you need to actually have permission to edit existing data sources so you can aggregate them differently, etc.? And then this is obviously important even at the very beginning when you're thinking about the data. You need to be thinking about what's the post-launch strategy? How will they be distributed? Do you have the correct permissions to roll this out across other divisions in your organization or to external organizations? So it's really important to sort of think about a lot of these things when you're just thinking about your sort of data structure. Another thing as well is thinking about the time period. Questions you want to ask are things like, will this dashboard cover multiple time periods or will it remain static? A really important thing is, or an example is, you have a dashboard that is really, easily put together. You've just got some table calculations here, and you've made a quick filter to filter between 2 months, and you've got the latest date up here. And that's really straightforward, and you might have been working on that for a long time. But then if the situation changes and somebody says, well, actually, we want to change this time period to move between different time periods, so we just don't want the latest month. We want dynamic parameters involved. And suddenly you realize you have to rebuild all your calculations, and it becomes a much bigger job than just whacking a few table calcs onto the chart. So it's really important to know how frequently things will be updated. Is your dashboard retrospective or in real time? Is it going, how far back is it going to be going? Because that will determine your dashboard content. Will I be allowed to include certain metrics depending on how we're dealing with time? Do I need a certain level of aggregation so I can split things up, within their constituent weeks or months or days? And obviously that will determine what kind of design decisions you can make, what sort of charts you can build, what kind of interactivity you can have. And again, how much you can sort of onboard people and let them know about what they're actually able to do with your dashboard. So bearing those things in mind, it's really important to think about like what can go wrong if you're not addressing these sort of scenarios. So we'll go through a few sort of scenarios of what can go wrong, and we can think about, when things go wrong in the project, whose fault is it? The first one is you've been asked for a simple set of finance KPIs, and knowing how long the build takes, you've agreed you can easily get that done in 2 days. When you email after the meeting for the required data, they say it's on the server, so you'll need to email so-and-so for data permissions. And that person is on holiday for a week, so the project is delayed by 9 days. Now, you would say, okay, they didn't let me know I was able to have access to this data, so it's their fault. But in reality, you have to ask yourself, with regard to the data access questions, did you ask who obtains the data when you made that promise? Did you ask where this data was located? And did you check what permissions were required and who had access at their end? So if you're not asking any of these kind of questions, and even things like with regard to the data structure, what type of data connection is this going to use? You can't just get an extract from somebody, you need a live connection. Okay, so these are questions that you say they didn't tell me, so it's partially their fault, but it's also yours because you didn't ask all of these things in advance, so you could preempt how long it could potentially take and manage expectations. Another question is, you're approaching the deadline for a large static reporting dashboard that's been tested and used over 4 months. Everything is working perfectly, and the day before a very important meeting, you're asked to add a quick filter as stakeholders now want to switch between months. So you say that's not possible, and it will take several days to rebuild with that functionality. And the stakeholders are very angry as this is a simple request. So whose fault is it? Well, you say it was built one way, and I was building under the assumption that this was a static dashboard. I've had several feedback sessions and nobody had any issue with this and it was working perfectly. But then you have to ask yourself the question, did you ask, is this dashboard covering long-term trends or comparing time periods? And maybe they said, oh, for now, we're just going to look at 1 month at a time. And you'd say, okay, well, with regard to the dashboard users, do you know the expectation of each stakeholder of this dashboard? And maybe they would have said, well, yeah, I mean, they want to sort of compare things over the month, but for now, they just want to see 1 month at a time. But just knowing that question helps you preempt that you need to build this dashboard so that it will be a dynamic dashboard, and you have to consider that in your filters and your parameters. So it's really important that no matter what they tell you at the first meeting, you're preemptively saying, what are the expectations? How is this going to be treating over time? So again, your fault. Next question. The stakeholder says at the start of the project that they're confident Tableau viewer, but they message demanding a meeting because they haven't got a clue how to work the dashboard you sent over. So whose fault? They've said that they know how to use it, but you have to ask yourself when you come across this problem, with regard to the dashboard user, when they access existing reports, what's the first few questions they're looking to answer? Have you addressed that in your dashboard? Did you know what they were expecting? In which case, how come you haven't addressed that? And again, with regard to the user, have you found out like what will their interaction be? So you've got their expectations, but you've also got to know what's the level of interaction that they're going to have with the dashboard. When you were thinking about your dashboard content, did you find out if certain numbers needed additional context? Because maybe they're looking and they're saying, this doesn't make any sense to me. Even if you have to explain it, you shouldn't have to. And have you considered about the onboarding pre and post live? Have you actually given a sort of pre and post live activities to help them on board to the dashboard? Have you sat down with them and walked them through how they're going to use it? Have you left interactivity so that they can signpost themselves around the dashboard? You need to be thinking about sort of the end user while you're building the dashboard, and you need to find out beforehand. You can't rely on them saying, I'll be able to manage. You've handed over and are moving on to another important project, but you've been called back to this one because they've switched the data source, edited something, and broken the dashboard. So whose fault is it? Well, another important question in the onboarding is, how is there a post-launch maintenance strategy? Did you agree that you would update the data source for them? Did they decide what they were going to be doing? And have you trained them on how to actually do this afterwards? And again, did you onboard them to sort of explain to them how they were going to deal with these? Other questions you need to ask as well is, what sort of time periods did you explain, how frequently this was going to be updated? Did you know that they were going to have different sort of data sources being involved? Oops. The last question is, you've created a wonderfully interactive dashboard and the stakeholder asks how to print the tooltips with the dashboard as they're essential to the PDFs of the dashboard they're sending out today. Now, obviously you have to say to them, well, that's not going to happen. And they're angry because they're saying, well, how am I supposed to get the extra information to the stakeholder? So you need to think back and say, did I ask what sort of interaction each stakeholder will have with the dashboard? Did I ask who is the audience for the dashboard? Because someone would say it's going to be distributed externally, it's going to be emailed to people. So there are questions like, how is it going to be distributed? So you're also asking with regard to the onboarding, how will the finished dashboard be stored and how will it be distributed? And then you can plan into your design, okay, I can't create a dashboard where all the answers are not immediately visible. You have to make your design as well decisions like, I can't put certain tooltips there because no one will see them. Or if I have got additional tooltips, I need to make sure the essential information is also on the dashboard. Okay, so the takeaway message here is a lot of things go wrong in a project and a lot of things are down to poor communication on other people's part. And, a lot of it is down to sort of people forgetting, people being delayed. But if there's anything that you could have asked beforehand, you need to feel personally responsible that you haven't preempted it. You can't wait for someone to throw a spanner in the works and feel like it had nothing to do with you. Okay, so then turning all these questions into sort of documentation that you can actually create for yourself so that you can share it with people and get the right requests and sort of confirmations from people. With regard to sort of your branding and visual best practice, you could be this could be a decision you're making yourself. It could be an external client. It could be an internal, your sales and marketing department or other creators who are using Tableau. But you want to find out like what branding documents they have, what color schemes they're using, what's their sort of established visual best practice, and do they have any sort of specifications and established practices that are already in line? So you need to ask for these informations from people. Do they have custom logos, custom fonts, everything like that, images they need to have? And you need all this so you can plan sort of your data story, what kind of content you're going to actually put on your dashboard, and all of your formatting, text and colors, etc., buttons and branding. So make sure you are asking all of the questions relating to sort of the data story, how is it going to be interacted with, and all of this, so that you can make sure you're getting the right information for all the visual best practice. The questions relating to data could be, again, it could be yourself while you're assembling your data sources. It could be the IT department. It could be a client who is sending things across to you. But you need to be you need to be considering absolutely every aspect of the project. So you can be asking them things like, can I have the list of names so I can very promptly get access if I need to? Can I, if the data structure is shaped differently because of the kind of content I'm going to be putting on the dashboard, I need to make sure that I can speak to someone and say, I absolutely need the data structure in this format. I need the dates in this format. I need such and such, this field to be Boolean. This field needs to be restricted by what can enter. So all of the questions that sort of affect what kind of charts you can build with your data structure, you have to have a very clear answer to every one of those things. So you can give that to whoever's cleaning your data and say, I need it to come out the other end looking like this. And then that will help the data you get back in return. With regard to the project manager, You're asking things like, all of my planning questions need to go through them. Do we know what we're trying to achieve here? Have I got the right resources? Am I getting the support I need to do my job properly? And also keeping track of your work to say, this is due at this time, we're running behind on a data source, and making sure that all changes and expectation management sort of comments are going up and down the chain of command. And similarly from them, you want them to be providing you with the correct benchmarks. When is my testing due? When is my sort of first round of design previews due? When is the client, expecting to get a minimum viable product, or the stakeholder expecting to see this for the first time? When are they expecting to hand over for the last time? And being very clear about when these things are changing depending on what changes with your work log. And similarly with the onboarding documents, whether it's a stakeholder, internal stakeholder, or an external client, you want to be knowing, okay, have I got the data story for them? Have I sort of decided exactly what content they need? Is the design very clear in exactly what they wanted? And most importantly, have I given sort of documentation they need to take ownership of this? It might be a training video on how to interact with it. It might be a list of definitions and metric definitions so they can very easily jump into the dashboard, make edits they need, take ownership of the dashboard, and continue editing and managing it themselves. So you need to be able to provide all of these kind of information so they can just take ownership of it, whether it's just to interact with it or to actually continue on building it and applying it to their own uses. So in summary, a data schema that has a good instruction of how your data is going to be structured so that it can serve your design purposes. A design document that includes all of your best practice, all of your plans for design, and all of sort of the best sort of practice design things that are required of your organization. For yourself, you're keeping a track of the data story, so you're constantly reminding yourself what your end goal is, regardless of what new suggestions come up. You're always thinking about, what is my final objective here? You're keeping track of benchmarks, so you're notifying people up and down the chain if timelines change, if requirements change, and you're managing expectations. And you're obviously keeping track of your work log, so when decisions change, you can refer back and say, initially this was the plan. If the plan changes, these 5 knock-on effects will also change. Can we agree that we're either going to do this or we're going to do the other? And lastly, you've got your onboarding documents where you're giving all of the sort of handover information onto somebody else as you close off the project and move on to someone else. So it's all about order. And this is a very sort of dry aspect of a project where you're talking about project management and things like that. And I just want to sort of leave you with a comment on sort of creativity, because a lot of the Tableau community is very creative, and there's a lot of conversation about, all these sort of, the art of the possible. And it's important to remember sort of how we think about order and creativity. So this is Mary Cantranchu, who's sort of one of the spearheaded the digital print revolution over the last 15 years. Richard Ajayi, who's a REBA prize winner this year for architecture, and of course, Steve Jobs. And I heard her say something very interesting before. Somebody asked her about her personal style, and she said, I don't have time to think about my personal style, and I always wear black because I've got so much other things to do. And what you'll find with a lot of creative people is they're minimizing order, they're minimizing chaos from all aspects of their life that don't relate to their project. And what you can do as well is, the more solid answers you have of definite yes, definite no, definite outcomes, you're removing actually all of the freedom, ambiguity, and chaos from your project. And you're just left with very pure, 2, 3 little things that can drive your creativity. Everything else is set in stone, and you can do something beautiful rather than doing something chaotic. And that's basically the crux of what these questions are about. They're about sort of A, always, B, C, communicating. Just always be communicating. Listen for what other people are saying. Understand the responsibilities for your role and others. Be aware of the project status and track processes, issues, and complications, and communicate your concerns, confirm your intentions, ask for clarification, minimize ambiguity, and keep track of your objectives and milestones, communicate gaps in your knowledge, and just, be organized. And that's really what this is about. Maintain order, understand your objectives, and always be communicating throughout the project. And that's it from me. Does anybody have any questions?
There is a couple of questions in the chat for you, Ruth.
Yeah.
So one of the questions is, I wasn't not too sure about the scenario with we want to print out the PDFs with tooltips, as you could still have asked this question, but where would the tooltips requirement have been caught? As at the stage of the stakeholder might have just said, we need to send out as a PDF and all some annotations. So where would that question kind of come into play?
Yeah, so if someone's saying that they're going to send a dashboard as a PDF, you probably would be trying to make sure that your dashboard is viewable as a static dashboard. You wouldn't be thinking about making an interactive dashboard if it's going to be primarily used as a sort of a static dashboard. And you might be asking things like, so if they say, okay, what will each stakeholder's interaction with the dashboard be? They're not going to interact, they're going to be looking at a PDF. Okay, that's an important thing for me to consider when I'm thinking about how I put the information on the dashboard. Does that answer the question?
Yep, I think it does, but I'm sure Sajil will come back if it doesn't. The next question is, I'm a new user of Tableau Online, and I am a small consultant. How can I share my work stored on Tableau Online with my client who is not part of my organization? Do I simply send them a copy of the file, or can I send them a secure link?
I'm going to let you comment on this as well, but you've got two options of, is this something where you might need to set up access for somebody on your Tableau Online, or would you need to just rely on sort of sending them hard copies?
Again, I guess it depends on how they want to engage with the dashboards. They said they'd love to give them access.
Well, if you're, are you able to do that sort of with your systems? I mean, it would depend on sort of, if they have access themselves, they would need to have their own Tableau desktop. So I would sort of defer to you on that, Lorna, in terms of what they're allowed to do.
Yeah, so the other options are to ask them to download Tableau Reader, and then you can send them a Tableau package workbook over. Tableau Online, you might be able to get some viewer licenses, which would then be able to switch between your different clients to view the different workbooks on Tableau Online.
Okay.
But if they have Tableau, then it's definitely worth them you sending over the workbook for that. Okay, there's one other question. Any good tips for dashboard performance best practices?
That's sort of a separate question to this. I mean, I think there's probably plenty of resources on the Information Lab website on performance tips and tricks, but you're always thinking about keeping your data source as small as possible, reducing sort of the amount of text strings, using sort of numbers and Boolean fields as much as you can, deciding whether your dashboard is live or an extract, depending on what calculations you have. But I mean, it would be sort of a long list of things that's probably worth dipping into another tips and tricks video that I think you can find on the Information Lab YouTube.
Yep. Two more questions.
Yep.
How are you supposed to get a client or a manager to answer all those questions?
Well, yeah, you're not really going to get somebody to answer those questions, because you're not going to sit down with a clipboard. Nobody would let you finish. So you want to start by asking yourself, sort of, okay, you start off by saying, how many of these questions do I actually know the answer of myself? You'll know your role. Like, I'm a Tableau designer, I'm a developer, I can do everything. What do you need guidance on? okay, you might need, say, some information on getting around the server. You might find that you do have challenges with things like communicating feedback. So maybe you might say, okay, for this project, I want my manager to maybe give me a little bit more freedom. So I'm going to put a note next to that to say, this is a big project, I need more access. And everything else, you might say, well, this is all fine. And as you go through, you'll find a lot of these questions you can answer, like, who obtains the data? Me. Where is it located? Me. Do I have access? Yes. What permissions are required? Oh, this is a new one. I'm going to mark that down. So the best thing to do is go through these at the start of a project on your own. Okay, I know the answer to these are an issue. And then out of that, you maybe pick 5 and you say, I'm going to raise this at the first meeting. And in that meeting, a lot of your questions are being answered because people are talking and they're saying things like, oh, we need this dashboard because we need to get some KPIs on our performance. And, we want to improve our sales or something. So you'll have all these kind of questions that they're ticking off all your boxes. And then you can revisit your notes and say, okay, now I know all of these. And on top of that, I asked them maybe 3 questions, like I specifically said, what is the goal? And then they would say, oh, actually, it's, something that we didn't specifically say, but it gives you more insight. So start by yourself, pick sort of 5 core questions you think are essential to know at the beginning, especially something like, relating to the data structure, maybe, for example, like time periods is probably the first thing you want to ask in the first meeting. But you'll find it's kind of an iterative process over sort of a back and forth. You're answering questions in a meeting, you're going back in your own time and saying, actually, now that I'm going through this list, that thing they answered raises another question down with relating to sort of maybe the dashboard content, because the 2 things they've said don't actually align based on the third option we have. So it's kind of, it's iterative. You don't ask them all at once. You're always revisiting it and saying, am I clear on all of these things? And then you're starting to build out sort of the questions you need to sort of ask other people, the information you need to get from other people, and the documents you need to share with sort of, creating your data schema or asking the design department for specific icons or buttons or things like that you realize you're going to need.
Perfect. Thanks, Ruth. Tim has asked, can he steal that for presentations?
Of course. I mean, I don't know what you mean by that, but this video is recorded, so you can sort of screenshot away, but the dashboard itself that you'll find online is just this dashboard. And then there's an extra button for you to download, like a full list of questions that you can sort of tick off as you go through your project.
Perfect. I've just put your viz in the chat as well, so people can go directly to that. Last question. Do you have any examples of a data schema or design documents?
No, because there's just too many infinite possibilities. So like a data schema could be a simple thing of you making a list of 10 KPIs and emailing it to someone and just saying, look, the dates need to look like this. The names need to be, less than 40 characters, or something like that. Or it could be a huge project between, 3 or 4 departments where there's a massive sort of data collection overhaul, and there's some really clear sort of data models built and tables in your SQLs that are sort of getting connected. So it's not a document that you have a template of. It's sort of a list of answers that turn themselves into sort of, yes, this is what's happening, in which case this person needs to provide this information. So it's actually just a sort of a collection of questions or a collection of answers based on, what your sort of organizational structure is and what you need to achieve. So yeah. And then with regard to the design documents, same thing again. Visual best practice is sort of everywhere on Tableau. So that's kind of standard stuff. And then things like design documents, it could be literally as simple as a screenshot of a client's website. And you'd say, okay, I'm going to copy these colors. Or it could be your sales, your marketing department's got a very specific guide where they've already stipulated, this is how wide our margins are, this is our font size for our headings, these are our corporate logos, and these are the icons you need to use for every scenario. And again, it's not something you build, it's available, you just take it and you implement it. So it can just completely vary wildly, and it's the kind of thing you'll build yourself based on the answers to the questions you ask.
Perfect. Thank you.
No problem.
There's one last question that just come in. Oh, there's two actually more questions. Tim, who unfortunately did miss the presentation, but he is going to catch up on the recording. Did you cover the politics of a project? I've often seen external project managers being used as political footballs to sort out internal discussions. Do you have any experiences of this?
Well, I mean, this is where these questions come from, because it always ends up being politics, where somebody says, oh, you know, and I think an important thing here is maybe like dashboard owners, who will own this dashboard? You ask that question at the beginning, because it's not just a matter of, oh, we're going to hand it to this department. Is it your project manager's project, or is it the data engineer's project, or is it sort of, you know, somebody else who's in a meetings project? And it's really important to get that answer very quickly, because you will find people coming in with their 2 cents as well. Who drives design decisions? Because everyone's going to have an opinion. And this goes back to, you know, this scenario where you have, you know, a lot of people are coming in with their ideas, and then somebody's then translating it, and it's sort of getting lost. And you're saying, okay, well, am I doing what you want, or am I doing what you want? Or am I doing what actually I think is the right decision? And that's why it's really important to kind of, as you go through, there'll be a lot of questions that kind of preempt this. Who's responsible for recording and action feedback? Because, you know, if there's a feedback, am I sort of interpreting it and telling down the line, I think they want you to do this? Or am I coming into them and saying, I can do that, yes, or I can't do that, no, and nobody in between is making agreements on my behalf? So those are the kind of things nobody gets the commitment from at the beginning. But if you get the commitment at the beginning, you can say, well, I thought we agreed, you know, I was going to ask them, or I was going to tell them what we could and couldn't do, or, you know, I'm the one driving the design decisions. Does that answer your question?
Tim will hopefully respond.
You can ask a follow-up question if you need to.
He said yes, it answers the question. Thanks, Tim. Another question. Any advice for someone that is a Tableau novice and being asked to transition from a BI tool to Tableau that includes design, development, deployment? The BI collection is quite extensive, and I'm the glorified DBA, developer, analyst, administrator, and everything in between.
Okay, let me see if I heard that properly. You're transitioning from a role and you're trying to figure out sort of how to do this well.
I think, yeah, I think they're just looking for advice on sort of obviously where to best begin.
Well, I mean, in terms of these questions, I think an important thing is finding out from sort of whoever's above you, asking them, what are your expectations of me, and trying to sort of work out, you know, like, where do you need guidance or further training? You know, because I think that's probably the most thing as well, is, do you know how to sort of approach other users as well? So if you're transitioning to a new role, you need to make very clear, you know, make it very clear at the outset, these are my limitations and I would like to develop in it further. So I think that's just about having the conversation about your current role and making sure whoever is sort of responsible for your development is aware of what you need from them. And you know, you have the right resources to access people if you need help. And, you know, I mean, this is going down to your sort of general level of proficiency, and, you know, your challenges is you're communicating this with someone. You're not just thinking it yourself. You're going to someone and saying, I have a problem with accessing data. I have a problem with, you know, defining what I actually need to do with my metrics. It's about just communicating it to someone in your organization.
Thanks, Ruth. They did say it wasn't a role change, but a transition to a new BI tool, which is Tableau. For that, I'd recommend you definitely come along to our Thursday training at 3, which we'll go through some of the Tableau essentials sessions. Check out our website for further information about those. But yeah, I think that's it. So thanks again, Ruth. It's been a real pleasure to listen to this, and I'm sure lots of people can learn from it and hopefully take some key things away from today. So thank you, everyone, and stay safe, stay well, and We'll see you in the future.
Okay, see you soon, everybody. Take care. Thanks for coming.
Bye.